Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Annie, and I am your host this morning and for the next Monday morning at Maine next week. So I've been with you through the month of April. We have a great crowd today. Thank you so much for turning out to listen to this presentation. I'll do a quick introduction of our presenter and then I'll pass it off since I'm sure you're here all for Maureen. So I wanted to say kind of briefly, or to put out there for you all to consider, that this Thursday marks Holocaust Remembrance Day, or Yom HaShoah. So before I introduce our speaker, I want to take a moment to encourage you to reflect on and acknowledge the importance of continuing to study our history and the lessons that we can apply to our present. Maureen Freedland and her husband, Robert Freedland, are leaders in our community in doing just that. They have given their time, their resources to encourage that reflection in our schools and in our greater community. In 2007 and 2015, they established 2 funds for the studies of the Shoah with the La Crosse Community Foundation. Those funds supply resources to teachers, students, and the community at large. You may recognize Maureen from her many years of service on the La Crosse County Board and her local advocacy to further community development, interfaith collaboration, the environment, and welcoming Ukrainian newcomers to America during their ongoing war. Maureen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. And I want to particularly thank the staff and Annie for inviting me in conjunction with Yom HaShoah. It was her idea to get me here at this time, and I'm really grateful for that. At this time when history is being removed from our bookshelves, including Holocaust material, and rights are being threatened too, I especially appreciate the invitation. And I thank all of you all for being here. My husband is here, my daughter Celia is in the back, and so many of my friends, and I really appreciate it. Some of you may recognize my beginning in this from the Listen to Your Mother series that was done about 7 or 8 years ago, where various people talked for 5 minutes only, about experiences with their mother. I called my segment Voices in Words Not Spoken. And then I went on to develop that for Viterbo's Holocaust teaching workshop. And in 2019, I made it a little bit longer because I knew a little bit more and I had a little bit more time and presented there. So some of you all may remember the very beginning from that. My mother had passed away 2 years earlier, and I was rather bewildered about how little I knew of her in some ways. So this is my mother, Jean, at 17 years old, before the war started in Czechoslovakia. The voice of the Holocaust was always in my childhood home. My brother and I grew up knowing that our parents were different and they had burdens from another time. The voice of 6 million dead lived in our home. My mother was tense, nervous, suffered from unclear stomach ailments. She sometimes screamed at me without logical explanation during the day, but also in her dreams at night. She wasn't like the cheerful, carefree American moms. She was a vivacious blonde, light-eyed, with European flair, who could speak of the opera, but not of baseball. And she didn't go to PTA meetings because she had an accent that embarrassed her. Even as a child, I recognized that she was plagued by past memories, but she didn't describe them, and I didn't know why. I didn't know about the Holocaust until I slipped into her bedroom when I was 7 or 8 and saw her tearfully looking at a book of photographs of emaciated bodies on a conveyor belt. I asked her what it was. She said nothing, closed the book. Confused and appalled, I ran from the room. That day was never again mentioned between us. It was her pattern to shut out questions. She told a reporter who once tried to interview her that she preferred to be alone with just her ghosts. We had a tense relationship. I felt guilt and resentment for not being the daughter in a life she would have chosen if her opportunities had not been taken from her. That she didn't really speak about the Holocaust during her lifetime was common among survivors. Survivors of the Holocaust in the 1950s and 60s didn't talk to their children about the horrors they managed to live through. They wanted to forget the war. No one wanted to listen anyway, and they just got on with their lives. But by the time of her final years, a deep, undeniable longing to learn more came to me. Especially through the COVID-19 quarantine, my goal of getting my mother's personal papers translated and piercing their meaning together wouldn't leave my mind. How did she survive when others didn't? Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005 destroyed most of the belongings of my parents, but I'd salvaged several folders and photo albums with unnamed people in them from an upstairs closet. And I do have two of the photo albums in the back if you all want to look at them. I actually have about 10 altogether. Completely different story how I even managed to have these things. So, information about the Jews in Czechoslovakia in World War II isn't as ample as from other European countries, and my mother has no remaining family there. I needed to first understand the historical context. Were there survival stories of brave Czechs standing up to Hitler? Are farmers willing to provide hiding in barn lofts? Priests willing to provide false religious papers or even baptize if it would make a difference with Jewish blood? What about the Nuremberg race laws and how were they applied in Czechoslovakia? So Google Translate immensely improved through the years. It was no longer this put one word in, see if you can figure out the odd, funny spelling and of Czech, which I have not mastered. I have not mastered pronunciation either. But it did improve so that I could do whole pages at a time. But my big break came in 2023 when I was put in touch with Tomáš Karab, a professional actor and tour guide in Prague, willing to be my researcher. Now, the idea of going to the Czech Republic to scout my mother's history has always seemed far-fetched and even ridiculous, but the steps fell into place. With the help of my ever-supportive husband, Bob, right there, first row, I found myself pivoting from lofty vacation ideas of Down Under or the Northern Lights to an exploratory cruise on the Elbe River from Berlin, Germany to Prague in the Czech Republic. Now, the Czech Republic is now more commonly colloquially known as Czechia, after it split off from Slovakia in recent years, and during the occupation, it was also separate from Slovakia. So meanwhile, Tomáš knocked on doors of archivists, obtained police records, sought out scholars to interview, sometimes by bringing boxes of chocolate to them, made scouting expeditions and much more before we arrived in Prague. Our week in May of 2024, stopping often for schnitzel and Pilsner Urquell beer, was quite enjoyable because so much work was done ahead of time. My father was also a Holocaust survivor from Slovakia, though with a really different story. So I even met new cousins from Slovakia on his side. To date, Tomáš contacted a dozen institutions, including museums and archives, securing information from over a dozen more people. I don't have all the mysteries unlocked, and I likely never will. But anyway, fate is often determined by sheer coincidence, irony, ludicrousness, even luck at times. And that indeed is an important message of what I've learned. I also grasped that one can never really know all the truth about someone else, no matter how deep they dig. Tomáš is continuing to interview and uncover more documents and witnesses, but I found what I was looking for to basically harmonize my mother's life and therefore mine, and I am satisfied even with some loose ends. Okay, some hardcore facts, including my mother's birth in 1922 as Irina Zhelezhna in the smallish town of Novi Bidjov, some 60 miles northeast of Prague. She was an only child, and later in the United States, she was called Jean. So you can see she seemed to live a life of privilege and comfort before the war. I have many pictures from vacations with her family to Italy, in the Balkans, in more places. There were many different types and backgrounds of Jews in Europe from different countries. Here's some more pictures of her growing up. And you'll note the one on the bottom on the railroad tracks. And I don't know what railroad tracks these were or how they played in her life later on. This is a partial list of institutions that I contacted, and it's growing, and I know you can't read it, but I think I included it because of appreciation for my children's excellent History Day education in the La Crosse School District, where they learned to do primary sources. And I understand Dr. Wagner's here somewhere, so thank you. He was in charge of History Day for many years. From Irina's mother's birth certificate, we located the very ancient original cottage in the tiny town of Nasilshny Chukya, where she was born. The birth certificate came from the registry at the nearest synagogue where Jewish children went for circumcision and Jewish naming. Irina's mother was without doubt Jewish. Irina's birth father was Karl Zelezny, and his birth registry says he is Catholic and even lists who baptized him. And this is the cottage that we visited in Nasilshny. I am named after her, you know, Milada Maureen, that's what you do in America. And I would ask you to take particular note here of the hybrid car and the recycling bin. Things change over time. That's my mother's birth certificate. Written quite clearly in the column for religion on Irina's birth certificate are the words Besh Vijnani, meaning no religion. That stumped me, astounded me. I mean, it really blew me away. Some context. Czechoslovakia in the early 1920s was a very secular country with intermarriages of even 45%. Nevertheless, I learned that Karl's mother made her son's marriage impossible because of the religious difference. So parental interference was likely a major reason for the divorce of my birth grandparents when my mother was a child. Parental interference may have been a vital key, ultimately, to my mother's survival. A big spoiler alert here, too. Tomas also discovered a peculiar notation across the first page of Karl's birth certificate. So you can see up at the top. Nope, sorry, up in the bottom. According to information on February 8th, 1921 from Novi Bidjov, Karl Zelezny is now without any religion. So likely February 8th is the date of my birth grandparents' marriage in 1921. I was born in 1951. Thus, it is possible, though odd, our scholars agreed, that there could be an entry of no religion for Irina on her own original birth certificate in 1922. There's also some notation there that this was checked out in 1940 or 1942, so the Nazis did follow up on this. This notation also shocked and surprised me. It really changed everything. Possibly my inquiry could have ended at this point and we could have toured some tropical islands instead. It's also been suggested to me recently that a notation of no religion might have other reasons to actually allow Jean's father to marry her mother in a synagogue, or it might have been about getting an exemption from paying religious taxes to support the churches, as was common in some European countries. And I'm trying to figure out how to do more research on this at this time. But at any rate, my Jewish grandmother remarried after her divorce to a Jewish man. In 1938, when my mother was 16 and the invasion of the Nazi occupation was nearing, Irina lived with her mother and stepfather in the northern Sudetenland. And I'm going to refer to them here on out mostly as just her parents, my grandparents. Irina wrote in a statement about the Neville Chamberlain line in the sand, failed deal with Hitler in Munich in 1938 that resulted in giving up the northern Czech lands to appease Hitler. And I'm sure you remember this, the peace in our time. And Hitler soon invaded Czechoslovakia and then Poland, sparking World War II. My mother wrote in a legal document after the war that I found, we were forced to go to the protectorate. All of our assets, liquor factory, house, etc., were appropriated and we received no compensation. My parents were forced to make a living by heavy physical labor in the streets. They probably had to clean the streets, possibly without even tools. We were forced from apartment to apartment. These are a few more pictures of my mother and her parents. So Novi Bijov in 2024 was a far cry from the soot-covered, somber town I visited with my mother in 1971, where a billboard in the town square celebrated 50 years of communism and a banner read, "Following Lenin will help us on our journey for our communist fate." Rather, a cheery red, "I Heart Novi Bijov" sculpture was on the town square. Who'd have thought? A doormat near our family home had a mocking image of Putin, that's on the bottom right, and there were many ways to see that Putin was despised in this country that America helped establish in 1918 as a vigorous democracy. Yet I read Human Rights Commission records that racist comments continue to appear in written documents by public leaders. In 2010, the mayor of Novi Bijov held Roma collectively responsible for a violent crime against a young girl and announced a series of repressive measures against the local Roma community. As quiet and non-controversial as my mother portrayed the town of her youth to be, I dug and found documentation of strong, visible, anti-Jewish sentiment since the beginning of the Nazi occupation, with confiscation of Jewish property, nights of smashed windows, and anti-Jewish signs. My grandparents would have worn Jewish stars on their clothing. I actually have one of those that came from my father's mother. My mother never told me any of this when I spent several charming days with her in Novi Bijov in 1971. But I've also read of new memorials and museums established around the Czech Republic with governmental support to honor Jewish Czech families and their ancestors. We saw Stolpersteins in some pavements in Prague. These are the brass memorial plates that those of you who've traveled in Europe may have seen in different countries. They're brass about this big, placed into the cobblestones of the outside the homes where victims of the Holocaust live, to memorialize them. You can see some of the cobblestones in the ground there. Those don't have the Stolpersteins yet. So we went to the family homes. I had seen these homes before. The lady in the middle was a very elderly woman who actually remembered some of my family. The librarian put us in touch with her, and we went to visit her. Window hospitality in these older countries, older towns seem to be through the window, the front window. We had a long conversation, and then for contrast, I put a picture of my great grandmother on the right side, who similarly entertained people. I loved it when I found both of those pictures. So I'm gonna mention these cobblestones later. Two of these family homes were our family homes, and my mother's fiance also was here, in one of the homes. And I'd previously written to the library in City Hall, hoping to get information. This was maybe 3, 4 years ago, but I didn't receive any response at all, so obviously showing up helped. Number 14. Okay. We visited the cemeteries to silently say Kaddish for my family. Kaddish is the ancient Jewish prayer sequence recited for the dead, although it doesn't directly address the dead, and instead gives thanks and praises to God, and ends with a prayer for universal peace. And it is part of every Jewish prayer observance, and we'll be saying it later this week in our synagogue in memory of the people who died. So I want to explain also that I actually have numerous pictures of family events in the Jewish cemetery, but this one is very special to me because it's the last one that I have of my mother and my grandmother in the winter of 1942. The one on the right, I took myself in 1971, so we had the picture to look forward to find. Took us a while, but we did find it. So I didn't have to do basic genealogy research. I knew as much as I felt like I wanted to know, as much as I needed to know. I was after the story, not the dates and the lineages. And that was why my research was actually so hard. And I had actually been turned down from several genealogy type services before I found Tomas. When she was 20 years old, my grandparents, widowed great-grandmother, and my mother's fiance vanished. We use the word disappeared now. Vanished from Novi Bidjov with 70 others. I recently learned from a cousin, as it was very important for me to know this, that my mother was in the home that I showed earlier when they left. There was a change of trains with the final leg from Kolin, Czechia, not that far away, to Terezin transit camp, about 40 miles away from Novi Bidjov. Terezin, Theresienstadt, ghetto, transfer center, concentration camp. It was all of these. 95% of the transports around this time were immediately murdered, bypassing Terezin and going directly to other concentration camps. With the usual Nazi precision for statistics, my grandparents received the numbers 319 for Maurice and 320 Milada. That same day, June 13th, 1942, Maurice and Milada left Terezin as AAI 795, that was Maurice, and AAI 796 Milada to Neznani, translation again, not known. Likely they were murdered that day. My great-grandmother Regina, who you saw earlier in the window, was later taken by railroad from Terezin to Treblinka on October 22nd, 1942, to be murdered. My mother's fiance, Robert, 27 years of age and therefore primed for an arduous physical labor selection, was brought to Auschwitz at some later point, and he almost survived the war, dying in Dachau in 1942. This is my mother and her fiance earlier. This is one of the train manifests for one of the trains. We found numerous documentation of their movement with the Nazi precision for numbers and for records. All of this was recorded. And I'm going to describe this a little bit better in a moment, but this is Kolin, where they went from. They went from Novi Bidjov to Kolin and then Kolin to Terezin. And these are modern pictures, the modern railroad tracks. The building on the right, though, is the school building that I'm going to describe a little bit better. This is a plaque on the schoolhouse door, and the only marker here, although the janitor did tell Tomas that people seemed to know what the building was, and they sometimes came and they looked in the windows. What was the day like on June 13th, 1942, when Milada, Maurice, Rosina, and Robert were transported to Terezin? This is the day that tore me up the most, and I was most determined to find out about it. How were the laws in Novi Bidjov how were the Jews in Novi Bidjov notified to depart? Did my mother see a summons and look for her own name? And did she watch her mother, stepfather, grandmother, and fiance report to the authorities? Was there a struggle? Was each allowed the one suitcase per person with its contents carefully prescribed, is exhibited now in the museum at Terezin, where they were taken? Did they think that they could flee, or did they know that that was impossible? What could that one day be like, June 13th, 1942? Astonishingly, I discovered much more about the exact transport my family went on. It appears there were only 3 survivors. Not them. We found an ordinance dated May 30th, 1942, which was staggering because it was the document that most immediately determined the fate of my family. It announced simply, quote, the gathering of Jewish community without mention of the purpose or the destination. So I want to stop here for a moment for anyone here keen on historical dates, and I know we have some people here keen on historical dates, and talk about a little bit about the connection between my family's deportations and the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the highest Nazi officials of the Czech Protectorate and the darkest figures within the Nazi regime. Heydrich was mortally wounded on May 7th, 1942, by Czech resistance fighters who parachuted in on a British-Czech operation. And Reinhardt's death was June 4th, and this was called, the code name for that was Operation Anthropoid, which a movie which some of you may have seen or still can get. So my grandparents were on their way to their death anyway, although entire villages, notably Lidice, were also immediately razed to the ground in retaliation for Heydrich's assassination. And overall, 1,300 Czechs, including 200 women, were killed immediately in reprisal. I had always assumed that my grandparents were deported because of the assassination, but they were on their way anyway. As I researched, I learned of the panic and waves of suicides as the mass deportations were intensifying. Many transports were given only one night to report for destination. For my family, the school building in Kolin, and at most a few days, although evidence is that Jewish people seemed to know the deportations were coming, and it was only a matter of scheduling. Tomas uncovered a photo. This single photo, but remarkable to me, of a half dozen women clutching each other as they walk alongside the railroad track, one elderly woman needing support. They wear long coats, although it is June, and do not carry suitcases. The day was described by a survivor as a very hot and humid day, probably before a storm. The museum director told us that people handed over the keys to their houses at the school building. They slept on the floor without coverings except for their coats, 3 days for my family, waiting for the next train to Nozlichny, the unknown. I also found a narrative of my grandparents' train from Kolin to Terezin in a slim book at the museum shop at Terezin. There were only 2 books there in English. And in one of those small world coincidences, I remembered that the writer, Dr. Dagmar Liebleva, had been Skyped into Aquinas in Lincoln Middle School several years before then. She was a close friend of Busia Lugovir, our dear lacrosse resident, symphony violist, and Russian emigre, who many of us know. The name of the book, as some of you may know it because it's used in Holocaust education, is Someone Made a Mistake, So I Am Here Now. Dr. Lieblova wrote about her train ride to Terezin. She remarks in here, "There is a beautiful view of the mountains, but at that time the mountains looked menacing. I have never before seen mountains such as those, of volcanic origin, and they depressed me." Okay, I'd have taken a better picture of the Sudeten Mountains, but I didn't know at the time when we visited Terezin, what I'd later be learning from Dr. Lieblova's written testimony. I think when I took this picture, I was more interested in the traffic lines and the lane lines and how they worked and how bicycle paths and so forth worked there. So, but you can see the Sudetenland in the background. Yurina's mother and stepfather, Milada and Maurice, sent grim postcards upon arrival at Terezin, as everyone was ordered to do this, listing some of the people they were traveling with, also stating they would soon leave to a location to the east and, quote, would continue straight to Poland. I have these postcards. We now know that, quote, the east and, quote, continuing to Poland, it meant exactly, even if they didn't know, that they were being sent to their deaths, probably that same day. Another woman whose testimony I found from the very same transport described the horror of transport from Terezin to the east. And this is a quote. "When older and very sick people were transferred to transports east, they transferred them to the gathering point by hearses, one squeezed next to another. It was a terrible, sad, sorrowful sight. The horror of transports to East was always great, despite the fact that we didn't know much about what was going on here. We would say to each other that in Terezin, we are in Czech and close to home, and we know what is going on in Czech. Over there, we would just go to the complete unknown." Of course, we know now that they were on their way to their deaths. If the old and sick even made it there, most actually went by cattle cars. So I have some pictures here of Terezin. Despite its intention to be a model transit camp to fool the public in the Red Cross, the terrible conditions of Terezin are well known. 30,000 people perished here from starvation, disease, extreme crowding, and brutality. And these are some of the student groups that were touring, and I loved taking the pictures of the student groups. They were very respectful. There were many of them. Also in Sachsenhausen, the concentration camp outside of Berlin that we visited, Holocaust education is now mandated in Germany, and it's taken very seriously. And we were there on a special day for the year. That was just accidental, where many nations gather to memorialize. And you can see the Ukrainian presence here. You can see particularly the wreaths on the bottom right. The positive emotion was very noticeable in Czechia for the current Ukrainian government and movement for freedom and independence from Russia. So, what about my mother, Irina, who stayed behind? I admitted I tested a lot of theories, some regrettably careless and harsh, and based on only a word or two in her papers, looking for something dramatic, spectacular, important, to be in keeping with quite a few Holocaust movies and books. And maybe also a good presentation here. Why was I so skeptical when my mother said, if the war had lasted longer, I would have been killed too? Doesn't everyone know that the Nazis intended anyone, even remotely Jewish, to die? Did Czechoslovakia go easy on Jews? Did my mother have fake identity papers? Was she perhaps baptized along the way by her birth father? Perhaps my mother was protected by a family of means, or a man of means, or even a Nazi. Was she a spy or something nefarious like that. So the scholars are very clear on the historical data that rescue or otherwise going easy on the Jews was very rare. In no other country occupied by Hitler, not even in Germany itself, was illegal rescue so rare as in the Czech Protectorate. Czechs caught assisting Jews with forged papers or hiding places were sentenced to death. Many Czechs generally disliked the Nazi occupation and offered some limited resistance, but overall they were basically compliant and even helpful in many regards, just wanting the war to be over with so that they could get on with their lives. So friends and educators here, I'm afraid it's important for me to point out and emphasize here something to you. There are several accounts of non-Jewish Czechs who risked their lives or positions to save Jewish people. And some in Europe are well known as righteous among the nations, like Oskar Schindler in Poland or Corrie ten Boom in the Netherlands. But again, this was very rare, and it isn't really the history of the Nazi Holocaust or the lessons to be derived from it. In no other country occupied by Hitler, not even in Germany itself, was illegal rescue so rare as in the Czech Protectorate. The exact number of Jews who survived in hiding is estimated at 424 out of 80,000 Jews. So 80% is 80,000 Jews in just the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and even more in Slovakia that had been split off, murdered by the Nazis. Repeating, the estimated number to survive by hiding was 424. Regarding baptism and the racial laws, there is a lot of research that baptisms from Judaism simply did not give you a free pass from the Nazis. Exceptions can be found in some places. This year, during my research, I was surprised to find records of baptism in my father's family in Slovakia, likely for career or protection, as Hitler was making his designs for Czechoslovakia. Yet as early as 1942, some of my baptized family members were taken away. I learned of a member of my family who believed that being baptized and married for 40 years to a Roman Catholic wife would protect him, but toward the end of the war, it did not. Father Tisu, the Catholic priest and commander-in-chief in Slovakia, preached at a holiday mass in 1942 that, quote, "A Jew remains a Jew, even if he is baptized by 100 bishops." And another time, Father Tisu declared that it was a Christian duty to expel the Jews, since it was to the benefit of the Slovak nation to free itself of its pests. 4 of my father's siblings and their children died in the Nazi ovens or by shootings, as I read in translated family letters, even with baptism taking place in the family. So, I guess you could say that a dramatic, extraordinary survival story of my mother didn't really materialize. The very kind and willing lady from the Jewish Czech Museum in Prague, as Tomas called her, his main contact there, put it into perspective simply this way. She said, "The most important fact, even more than the racial laws that occasionally were applied more loosely than required, is that my mother was formally born without religion. That, along with a great deal of luck, in a time of unluckiness, coercion, and tragedy," she said. "If there would have been some more important figure, more diligent, your mother could easily end up in the same transport as some others later on. The human factor was very important." So it was as simple as that. Her birth certificate said she had no religion. There are still gaps in my mother's story. Throwing me off through the years was the trove of unidentified photos of beautiful Irina with other seemingly carefree, handsome, blonde young men and women paddling on the Elbe River that would cruise from Berlin. We still don't know how Irina managed to obtain a plum assignment as an assistant in a photography studio after her parents' deportation in the nearby spa town of Podzibrady, where she worked until the end of the war, In this period of total work requirements, other Jews were forced into hard labor, many even outside of the protectorate. Yet clearly behind those idyllic pictures, we found confirmation, though not directly from my mother, of the terror and torment within her untold story that she displayed for the rest of her life, and that she reverted back to in her final years, well in her 90s, in nursing home care here in La Crosse at Eagle Crest North. Stuck in her memories over and over, she asked Bob and I to go to the Gestapo for her and find out when her mother and fiance were returning. My mother said to me that periodically she would be called in and interrogated. She said, I was able to tell them a story and keep them off me. To her caretaker and friend here in La Crosse, Florent Griff, who might be here, I hope. She told about some SS soldiers coming into the house where she was staying with a 16-year-old girlfriend, and the stomping of their boots being the most terrifying sound she ever heard as the girl was pulled from her arms and taken away. My mother told her legal advocates, but not me, that she was followed by the Gestapo and beaten by the Gestapo. She wrote in a legal affidavit that I suffered mental depression, stomach gastric ulcers. The end of the war found me with no money, no home, and nervous breakdown. Whole family and my relatives, such as grandmother, uncles, aunts, and cousins, died. So these are some pictures from her time in Poggibratti. I'd not even heard of Poggibratti until my mother's last difficult years in her 90s here in La Crosse, as both cloudiness and clarity were settling into her brain. We just thought it was a funny name and didn't know what to make of it. Tomas located this from the Poggibratti Police Department. It was her work and identity card in Poggibratti, and these were necessary documents during the period of occupation and total work employment. You can see also, it says up there at the top, no religion. So when Tomas took an early scouting trip and I learned what and where Poggibratti was, I cried as I downloaded pictures that I'd stared at so blankly for many years. I hadn't known Poggibratti existed, and I never expected to actually be there. So Poggibratti was a spa town. You go to the spa, you go to Poggibratti to take the waters. And that strange picture of my mother was my mother taking the waters. And if I had more time, I'd show you a videotape of Tomas, the professional actor, inventing a commercial about taking the waters. The waters are mineral waters, and we didn't much care for them, but I guess it's an acquired taste. Okay, this is her sitting by a fountain. Tomas's sources speculated that these could have been advertisements for the photography studio. And there would have been Nazi flags outside here. So the sum of Tomas's investigations in Poggibratti was that there weren't military installations or much other war activity going on in Poggibratti. Maybe Hitler Youth, but Nazi soldier regiments there. And again, people there just wanted to get on with their lives. I have a list of 79 of my mother's family members titled at the top, list of our sweet family and of our dear martyrs in the time of fascist occupation, 1942 to 1945, who perished in the end. My mother is in the lower right, and her closest family, including her parents and grandparents, are there. We went back to Prague. This is the Pincus Synagogue in the Jewish Quarter, the former Jewish ghetto, actually now one of the major tourist sites. I knew my family names were somewhere on the walls, and a half dozen friends have honored me by finding them, essentially visiting my family. And when people tell me they'll be touring Prague, I send the information on how to locate them. And you can see Dr. George Croker's umbrella there pointing out their names. He was the first one for me to find them. but I'd not seen the inside until last year. My mother never saw this either. In 1971, the building was shuttered and in poor repair during the communist regime, and the Nazi guard refused to let us in, although she pleaded with him. We saw posters throughout the country and also in Germany, pleading for the return of the kidnapped hostages on October 7th. These are the Jewish cemetery gates. The oldest grave dates back to 1439, belonging to the poet and Kabbalist Avigdor Kara. For centuries, Jews were not allowed to be buried outside the ghetto walls. So there are 12 burial layers with about 100,000 deceased resting on an acre of 2.4, on an area of 2.4 acres. Anti-Semitism is very old. So my mother's anxiety had a basis later in America about the consequences of drawing unwanted attention and revealing too much of herself. Cooperation, conformity, avoidance seemed to be her best strategy, in other words. Urina's complicated religious identity continued to play a role in her life, even after the Nazis and their supporters destroyed so much of it. My brother and I could see her emotional pain, especially when we attended the synagogue, and she quietly sobbed, though we didn't know why, and it confused us. My mother had friendships with other survivors through Jewish organizations. Stories and memoirs were beginning to catch on at the national level, notably Gerda Weissman-Klein's 1957, All But My Life, which is also used very regularly still in Holocaust education. My copy, with a cover cost of $3.50, has Klein's dedication reading, "To Jean Ferran, with all good wishes and friendship, Gerda S. Klein." And it has traveled with me on numerous moves across the country. It's a book that's always going to keep traveling with me. By now, I consider the compelling need to learn about and to continue telling the story of the Holocaust of weighty importance to me, especially as the survivors are dying. Even in 1957, Weissman-Klein knew to pen her past with tears and with love, in the hope that my children, safely asleep in their cribs, should not awaken from a nightmare and find it to be a reality. I'm compiling a family narrative for my family. I hope I can find ways to share this story, ordinary yet extraordinary, with others, and I'd be happy to bring it to your group. Tomas has approvals to place Stolpersteins, the brass memorial pavement bricks that you see throughout Europe, in the pavements outside the homes in Novi Bijov of my grandparents, great-grandmother, and Urina's fiance. And I hope to be there when that happens. There is no dramatic ending to this story. I offer up no morals or lessons to you. There are no heroes to thank for my mother's survival. I do not believe that my mother ever had the kind of religious faith that would let her conclude there was divine intervention after 6+ million Jews and 3+ million more were murdered in the Holocaust. And so I cannot offer that up to you either, nor can I say that she ever forgave. She did not. I continue to have questions I wish I could ask her, and words of comfort I wish I could give her. Out of a loving family, she was the only one able to survive, yet she has 6 great-grandchildren being raised in the Jewish faith. 4 on the top are mine and Bob's, and the other 2 are my brother's. The inscription that I placed on my mother's grave in 2016 was, "Wounds heal, love lasts," leaning on the popular novel, The Nightingale, about 2 French sisters quietly saving Jewish children from the Nazis. Wounds heal, love lasts, we remain. My mother was wounded, she survived, she remained, she loved, and she mattered, whether ordinary or extraordinary. Thank you for listening. I don't know if anyone has any questions or if we have time. Yeah.
Rather traumatic experience in her lifetime. But, did she ever mention like happier times, fond memories of, the time she spent with her grandparents or her parents?
Not so much. Not so much. She pretty much blacked out that, I think, just subverted all that. I tried to get some information about how religious was her family growing up, because it did really matter, as far as application of the Nuremberg race laws, whether there was active participation in a synagogue or not. And I just never got answers to the questions. We know that at Christmas time, she had a goose with her friends, and she had a Christmas tree and that kind of secular life that Jewish families in America sometimes do also, but I really don't know much about her life at all. Thank you.
Maureen, what was her path post-war in terms of coming to the United States?
Oh, what was her path coming towards the United States? Okay. Bob said I should say that, but it's there's so much there. In a nutshell, after the war was over with, she lived in Prague for a few years. She was a secretary to the very influential Minister of Commerce. How she got that job, we don't know. Maybe because she was young and pretty. I don't know. And we have evidence that she was followed and documented by the Stasi during that period of time, which is a whole nother story about having, I don't know, made up stories, I think, maybe not made up stories of her and men. I think the Stasi just invented stuff if they couldn't find it. But at any rate, she managed to get the foreign commerce minister to give her a visa to go to see a relative in Brazil. And meanwhile, my father, who had lived during the war in Palestine, he had escaped Czechoslovakia 3 days before the gates closed and gone with his brother on a boat. We call those Exodus boats now, to the British Mandate. They were illegal boats, and they had to travel for 3 months at sea and ultimately jump off the boat to get into Haifa. He worked in Palestine, also joined the Czech division of the British Army. It was later stationed in London. And then when the war was over with, he and his brother went back to Slovakia, and they found a few relatives, but they didn't really find much. And his brother chose to stay there, and he's still there. But my father said, I'm not staying here. I'm getting out of here. I'm going someplace else. So somehow he managed to end up being deployed in Brazil too. And they met each other. The rest is history. We got married. We had family in New Orleans who had been in Czechoslovakia, around 1910, 1920 or so, when you could still travel Europe pretty easily. And they remembered that they had a big family back in Europe. There were 21 siblings. I can't give the exact number, but 17 or 18 of them died in the Holocaust. But my relative in New Orleans was able to locate my father and invited him to come to the United States to live. And that's how they got there. And that's why, to me, it's so important, this whole immigration thing and welcoming people and, not being so concerned about borders and as we know, we have to welcome people here and give them a new start. Bob and I have brought some Ukrainian families here, and they are hardworking, they're all employed, they love it here, and they are scared to death that any day now, their permission to be in the United States is going to get pulled from them. So, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Just wondering, because your mother would conceal her feelings as much as she could, when you took the first trip back with her, were you in tune to her demeanor or, anything that she would say going back there?
My mother was a very uptight person who didn't let loose too easily. She kept her emotions to herself. She obviously didn't want to tell this story because my brother and I had asked her through the years. It's not like we hadn't said, hey, Mom, what was your story? My father would talk all the time about his story. But she wouldn't. Bob would videotape my father and then turn to my mother and say, okay, your turn. But she was out the door. So she just didn't want to talk about it. And she was, like I said, she was nervous, she was tense. She had really high standards for my brother and I. All she wanted to do was to succeed in America. She knew that that was primarily through education. So education was really important. As long as our grades were good at school, we could ride our bicycles anywhere and basically do whatever we wanted to do. But we didn't talk. We didn't have a real good communication. We just kind of basically, I don't know, existed. Actually, I kind of disliked her a lot in a lot of ways. So all this work since then and finding out all this has really been very important to me. Very important. Yeah, thanks. I know, but the answer is no. When I visited Novi Bidjov, I didn't know any of this. Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Wegner around here could answer that better, but this was, there was a lot of mixed German and Czech heritage and people there, and the status depending on who you were. And the Germans were in the Sudetenland, and that's why Hitler wanted to partition it. So I don't believe that my mother ever really conscientiously studied German, but a lot of the authority stuff, I mean, these were Nazi imposed postcards, and Nazis told them, you have to write these postcards. And they knew enough German to get by and do what they had to do. And then after the war, I'm just starting to read, is real interesting that the Czechs threw the Germans out over a period of a few years, which is kind of a different part of history I hadn't known about before. Yeah.
The book that she read, and when you walked into her bedroom, that she got really upset because the book away, did that survive the Hurricane Katrina?
It's a good question. I don't think so. No, no, I don't think it did. I just remember it distinctly, and I probably was looking at the same pictures that many of you all have looked at the ovens in the conveyor belts. But no, I don't have that one. Thank you though. Anybody else? Bonnie.
Fabulous, glorious picture of your mother. When was that taken?
She belonged to a number of Jewish women's organizations. Hadassah was one of them. They support medical work in Israel. And they have galas where they raise money. And she was very close conscious. She made deals with my other relatives in New Orleans where she would bake European pastries, petit fours, and strudel and so forth. And in return, they would give her their clothing because she couldn't afford to do that. My father had to really start from the beginning and work his way up to send us to college. And she loved to dress up. And yeah, and this was the picture that I used in her obituary and that I have, yeah. Yeah, I also have a portrait that was done of her, an oil portrait that was done of her when she was about, I don't know, 17 years old, because evidently, in Europe, you did portraits of young eligible women and then you showed them around. So, but she really was a beautiful looking. That story is also in Gone with the Wind, second one. Thank you. My father, she always said that I took after my father and my brother took after her, but thank you for saying she was beautiful. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Oh, continually, yes. It's first in the 1960s, it was very difficult because of all the different changes in the communist regime and the opening of borders and the applications of visas. And she was always very afraid to go there in the beginning. But eventually those things, after the Prague Spring and all that, she was able to go back easily. And both of my parents, they just loved going to Europe. I was just telling someone that my mother always told me that Prague is actually west of Vienna, that everybody considers Vienna the cultural capital of Europe, but Prague is actually west of Vienna. So, yeah, they traveled back, and you remember when airfares and Icelandic Airlines were $215, they would, they would go every couple of months. So, yeah. But they loved America, and they were good citizens, and voted, and we're very grateful for the opportunities they had. Okay. Thank you.